In the harsh hours of World War II, National Socialist Germany required men who, more than serving an ideal, were at the service of a function or a task, beyond their sympathies or ideological affinities, and who could fully perform to ensure the achievement of the regime's objectives. One of these men was Heinrich Müller, devoted to discipline in the military sphere from a young age, who, over time, became the director of the Gestapo, the surveillance and intelligence police agency of Third Reich Germany. From this position, almost in the shadows, Müller would expertly lead his work in the Gestapo until the end of the war and even his mysterious fate. Join us today to learn about the life of Heinrich, his rise and unusual fall in the Nazi regime. Heinrich Müller was born on April 28, 1900, in the city of Munich, which belonged to the Bavarian region of the then German Empire. Müller was born and raised in a Catholic working-class family. His father is an officer in the German field gendarmerie, and his mother is a housewife. Müller is also the only child of this marriage. As for his homeland, the German Empire, this powerful state embedded in the heart of Europe, was officially formed as a constitutional monarchy on January 18, 1871, with the proclamation of King Wilhelm III, Wilhelm I, as emperor at the Palace of Versailles. This was achieved after the unification of numerous smaller German states led by the Kingdom of Prussia. This unification was the result of a series of successful wars led by the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, such as the Danish War of 1864, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 1871. With the final victory in this war, the creation of the empire was consolidated, also known as the Second Reich, which included 39 German states and microstates. From its founding until the year 1900, when our protagonist was born, the German Empire experienced impressive economic and industrial growth, becoming one of the strongest industrial and military powers in Europe. Under an authoritarian monarchy, with a government led by Prussia and its army, the German Empire transformed its political structure and developed a modern economy, with a significant increase in urbanization and industrialization. Also, the empire maintained a foreign policy focused on preserving European stability through alliances and avoiding major conflicts. However, tensions with France and other powers still persist. This takes place within the framework of the so-called Armed Peace, a period that, although peaceful, is characterized by the increasing arms development among European powers. These are structured under a complex and fragile system of alliances that, sooner rather than later, will lead to a much larger military conflict, an earlier military conflict. The protagonist, the boy Heinrich Müller, spends his childhood in several cities such as Ingolstadt, Schwergenhausen, and Kumbach, where he attends elementary school. In his school reports, young Heinrich Müller is described as an academically average student with a tendency to hide the truth from his parents, but with a remarkable performance in technical subjects such as mechanics. He also has a reserved, methodical, and orderly character in all aspects. In addition, his father's military character in the Campo Gendarmerie. After finishing elementary school in 1914, Müller decided not to continue a secondary or higher education, but instead enrolled as a mechanical apprentice at BWF, a Bavarian company dedicated to the manufacture of military aircraft. Müller's entry into BWF coincided with the beginning of World War I, an event that, due to its great complexity, deserves a separate video. As for the German Empire, it entered the war motivated by geopolitical interests in Europe and the search for new markets and territories. and a perennial economic rivalry with France and England, who, with their great military power, limited Germany's expansion almost towards the end of the conflict. At 17 years old, in 1917, Müller finished his apprenticeship at the BWF and enlisted in April 1918 in the aviation group A2A as a pilot of the Imperial German Air Force, skillfully carrying out reconnaissance flights and bombing missions, standing out especially for a bombing he carried out alone in Paris. Against France, England, and the United States on November 11, 1918. The German surrender is followed, in 1919, by the signing of the controversial Treaty of Versailles, which imposes humiliating conditions on the empire, which at one point was convinced of its victory. Some conditions of this Treaty of Versailles are that Germany had to begin a disarmament program, cede significant territories and its few colonies, pay enormous economic reparations, and allow the military occupation of strategic areas such as the Rhineland. These events take place in line with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last emperor of the German Empire. After the power vacuum left by him, several actors on the German political scene promoted the formation of a National Constituent Assembly in February 1919 with the purpose of. After these events, on August 11, 1919, a new constitution was enacted in the city of Weimar, establishing that the German Empire, while preserving that name, no longer exists under a constitutional monarchy, but as a federal and democratic republic with a president elected by direct suffrage, a parliament called the Reichstag, and a chancellor in charge of heading the government, appointed by the president. These changes were intended to mark the beginning of what has been historically known as the Weimar Republic, an attempt at an advanced democratic state in Germany, but which quickly, due to the internal and external difficulties of the post-war period, degenerated into a period of continuous upheaval in partisan struggles, marked political instability, and a disastrous economic crisis. This is the environment in which Heinrich Müller, who was not even 20 years old. Germany, Heinrich, will soon face in his life as a former combatant. After the end of the war, once the war ended in 1919, Müller was demobilized from the Air Force, not without first receiving military honors such as the Iron Cross, first and second class, the Cross, the Aviator Commemorative Cross, and the Bavarian Military Merit Cross. Several biographers suggest that during his time in the war, Müller strengthened his innate sense of discipline, secrecy, and technical rigor, giving his personality a colder and more methodical character. Back in his native Bavaria, he witnessed several of the most violent political events of that year, 1919, such as the assassination of the socialist leader Kurt Eisner, and the rise and fall of the so-called Bavarian Soviet Republic, an attempted communist regime in that region, carried out by sympathizers of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The terror and violence unleashed by the Bavarian communists against innocent civilians generated in Müller a marked animosity and hatred toward the communists, an attitude he would maintain throughout his life. In the same year, 1919, Müller joined the Bavarian State Police as a recruit, and with main tasks including the repression and persecution of communist subversion in the region, alongside ordinary civil control. The following year, in 1920, he was promoted to work in the archives section of the intelligence department. The Bavarian police, where he dedicated himself to organizing and creating files on suspects and agitators, as well as developing tracking systems for each suspect. And even more, he dedicated himself to compiling informant testimonies, creating a centralized filing system that he would later imitate during his time in the Gestapo. During this time in the Bavarian police, a large number of files with the names of suspects passed through Müller's hands, all the communist, monarchist, and liberal tendencies. But until 1923, the names of several members of the so-called National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the Nazi Party, began to appear more and more frequently in the files. Among them, the name of a young former soldier and rising politician stands out, named Adolf Hitler, who at that time was the visible leader of the National Socialists. What? As a member of the Archives section, Müller continuously monitors and documents the movements of the National Socialists. He even experiences the famous beer hall putsch firsthand, from November 8 to 9, 1923, which was an attempt by the National Socialists to seize power in Bavaria. Müller, from the intelligence department, closely observes these events, but suggests to the police not to intervene and to leave the matter in the hands of the army. That the National Socialists should be crushed, with whom he had no ideological affinity at that time. The beer hall putsch turned out to be a failure in terms of its immediate objectives, with several National Socialists killed and Hitler and several other leaders arrested. However, far from being destroyed, the National Socialists would soon regroup to change their strategy, shifting from street violence to the political platform as a means to seize power. Returning to Müller, at the end of 1923, he was transferred to the political department of the same Bavarian police. In this new position, Müller moves into direct action and coordinates an extensive network of informants and spies to infiltrate both the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, gathering information and penetrating the meetings of both groups. He also focuses on arresting individuals suspected of belonging to these groups, especially the Communists, whom he considers more dangerous. An interesting aspect of Müller is that he carried out his duties without any political inclination and with a serious impersonality in his position. That is, without seeking to favor or harm any group from his position based on his own political inclinations, limiting himself solely to obeying the orders he received or carrying out the tasks that his position required of him at that time in the political department. On July 17, 1924, Müller married Sophie Dickner, daughter of Otto Dickner, a prominent figure in the so-called Bavarian People's Party, a regionalist Catholic group with which Müller shared ideological views, but did not directly support. 2 children would come from this marriage with Dickner. Rainer Müller was born in March 1927. Many years later, Elisabeth Müller in September 1936. Going back to Heinrich Müller, due to his relentless and impeccable work in surveillance and infiltration within the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, he was appointed Secretary of the Criminal Police in Bavaria on July 1, 1929. The Criminal Police, unlike the Bavarian police, was a special division of the German National Police dedicated exclusively to criminal investigations and forensic analysis related to cases such as murders, robberies, fraud, and other crimes that were not political at the time. Müller's presence was required in this agency because insecurity and crime in Germany, especially in Bavaria, were reaching alarming levels during those years. And a discreet, disciplined, and efficient man like Müller was needed to counter the situation in Bavaria. But aside from carrying out the task he was assigned, Müller ended up doing what he knew best, coordinating, now with a higher rank, intensive investigations and surveillance against the Nazis and the Communists. During his time as Secretary of the Criminal Police in Bavaria, Müller continued building extensive files on Nazi and Communist militants, journalists, merchants, Jews, and figures from the political opposition. These files turned out to be so detailed that the Nazis would later use them as a fundamental part of their intelligence work. At the same time, Müller introduced innovations such as the application of Soviet interrogation methods with psychological techniques and advanced coercive tactics to obtain confessions and denunciations from those under investigation. Under his authority in September 1931, Müller handled a particular case, the apparent suicide of a young girl, Angela Raubal, in her uncle's apartment, who was none other than the now successful 42-year-old politician, Adolf Hitler, whom Müller had kept under close watch since the beer hall putsch in 1923. Angela's death, surrounded by controversy due to Hitler's alleged infatuation with his niece, it is handled diligently by Müller, who, knowing Hitler's delicate position in politics, clarifies that it was indeed a suicide, in which he had nothing to do with it. This, according to some researchers, would have made a good impression on Hitler regarding Müller's performance in the following months. With the political neutrality that characterized him, Müller continued his work of monitoring and tracking both left-wing and right-wing movements. This, together with his experience in police work, had earned him the respect and admiration of leaders of the Nazi movement. And Rainer Heinrich, eccentric and interesting personalities of the National Socialist movement, about whom we also have interesting videos on our channel, which we invite you to watch. By 1933, the heavy situation of instability and crisis in Weimar Germany continued without any signs of stopping. Soon, and since the beer hall putsch and its first uprisings, the National Socialist Party had grown in every aspect, with a broad base of popular support and control of 33% of the parliament, which made it a solid political force compared to the governments that came and went constantly. In this sense, the esteem that Himmler and Heinrich felt for Müller was no small thing, because for his part, Himmler is the leader of the SS, which at that time was an important paramilitary group loyal to the Nazi Party. While Heinrich worked under Hitler's orders, Himmler was the director of the intelligence service. Later, when political instability, street violence, discord among the main parties in Germany, and even rumors of a civil war reached their peak, then President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor or head of government of Germany on January 30, 1933. Originally intended to ease tensions and form a nationalist government. However, in reality, Hitler's rise marked the beginning of a new era for Germany, known as the Third Reich, which came to bury the turbulent Weimar Republic, and in which Germany would embark on a rapid path of economic and military rise by implementing the economic and social principles of National Socialism outlined by Hitler. From his position as Secretary of the Criminal Police, Müller had witnessed the meteoric rise to power of those agitators, whom he had first documented in 1923. For a moment, Müller believes he is in danger for having once suggested to the Bavarian police that they neutralize the Nazis before they came to power. However, Müller will be greatly surprised to learn that the Nazis, far from wanting to remove him from public administration, invite him to work with them because of the good impression he had made. Thus, despite not sharing their ideology, Müller agrees to work in Hitler's new government. And with that, his involvement will soon become a hidden but key piece in the functioning of the Nazi regime. With Hitler's rise to power, he gradually eliminates his political opposition and consolidates himself as the supreme leader of the German nation, a fundamental step that Hitler takes after coming to power. The SS, with its nearly 52,000 members, is consolidated as a paramilitary organization or militia, separate from the German army and regular police, coming under the direct orders of Hitler himself. In this sense, Müller, on April 26 of that year, 1933, the then Minister of the Interior, Hermann Göring, created the so-called Secret State Police, or Gestapo, by its initials in German. This entity, initially led by the lawyer Rudolf Diels, was created from the unification and organization of several police institutions in Germany. From Weimar, it was attached the following year, that is 1934, to the SS, commanded by Heinrich Himmler, who appointed Reinhard Heydrich as the second director. On April 20, 1934, Müller joined the SS. With membership number 107,043 and the rank of second lieutenant, from which he would gradually rise shortly after. Müller was appointed inspector of the Gestapo in Berlin, being responsible for supervising the actions of the Gestapo's second department, which carried out supervision and detailed monitoring of the position. Communist, monarchist, liberal, and as part of the National Socialist Hydrological Program to the Jewish community. All these elements under Müller's orders could become subject to imprisonment. In the first concentration camps built during the Third Reich, in which the inmates are subjected to forced labor in mines, military equipment factories, and construction of facilities. For the government, especially in the persecution against the Jews, it becomes more severe. Between 1934 and 1939, following the enactment of the so-called Nuremberg laws, aimed at promoting the increase of the native German population. By virtue of this law, Müller coordinates deportations, interrogations, and the seizure of assets from Jewish circles, known, among other things, for their usurious practices in financial management, for the promotion of ideas considered as a way of life by the regime, and finally, for the violence of the law. And, in general, with the arrival of the National Socialists, they already represented a serious national problem for some. In Germany, however, the Jews are not the only group that suffers firsthand from the persecution of the SS and its police branch led by Müller, that is, the Gestapo. Communists, Social Democrats, liberals, conservatives, and monarchists are also subject to persecution and imprisonment in concentration camps. Furthermore, on the other hand, large religious groups, such as Catholics, also find themselves extremely restricted for resisting on more than one occasion the policies of the Third Reich. In this regard, Müller continues with relentless coldness in carrying out these tasks as the first years of the Third Reich go by. And as for Germany, between 1933 and 1939, it undergoes a dizzying shift in its status as a country, leaving behind the decadent situation of Weimar Germany. Economically, the Third Reich implements policies that manage to rescue Germany from the deep post-war crisis. Through massive state intervention, large public projects are promoted and a hidden rearmament is carried out, using financial mechanisms such as the so-called MIFO bills. For its part, unemployment, which had reached catastrophic levels by 1939, falls to historic lows, reaching almost full employment that year. Thus, the German economy is oriented towards autarky and prepares the ground for a massive war effort, with notable growth in the military industries. Politically, the death of President Hindenburg in August 1934, the positions of president and chancellor are merged, and Hitler officially assumes the title of Führer, which means leader or chief, and from which he has broad constitutional powers. At the same time, backed by strong popular support, a system is established in Germany where the National Socialist Party controls all branches of government. Political freedoms are eliminated in the face of it turns into a one-party state. From a social point of view, the regime implements extensive control over the lives of citizens. Civil organizations and unions are placed under Nazi control, and policies aimed at preserving the so-called German Aryan race are promoted. In addition, propaganda and laws of this kind institutionalize the persecution of groups such as Roma, Poles, Russians, Catholics, and Jews. On the international diplomatic level during this period, Germany witnesses the open breaking of the impositions of the Treaty of Versailles. In this sense, Germany's foreign policy focuses on commercial expansion. Police in Germany, agencies eliminate the government, promote preserving the so-called German Aryan race, and preserving the so-called German Aryan race. Versailles. This process begins with the remilitarization of Rhineland in 1936 and the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the signing of strategic pacts such as the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan and the alliance with Italy under the Rome-Berlin axis, in addition to the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Thus, through its economy, politics, and diplomacy, Germany marches to the sound of military bands and underbanners with the swastika, seeking to establish itself as the hegemonic power in Europe, preparing everything for the war of global military proportions that would soon break out. With the formal beginning of World War II on September 1, 1939, the opposing sides quickly became distinct. On one side, vigorous National Socialist Germany joined forces with Mussolini's Italy and Emperor Hirohito's Japan, both of whom we have interesting documentaries about on our channel. On the other side, against the so-called Axis powers, are the Allied forces, made up of countries like France. There was the Soviet Union, Germany, which was first Soviet history, in this case the countries of the Soviet Union, the more Soviet countries, Soviet like the Soviet Union Army, like the Soviet Union Army. The start of the war sets off alarms in the Third Reich, which, with the new war situation, must reinforce internal security, and of the new territories it will annex. To this end, on September 27, 1939, just 26 days after the start of the World War, the Central Security Office is created. In the Reichssicherheitshauptamt by its initials in German, this new organization centralized and merged the four police forces which until then had been independent that existed in Germany. That is, the Gestapo, the SS Security Service, the Security Police, and the Criminal Police, entities whose functions, tasks, and missions were often confused. Now, the central office is divided into 7 sub-offices, ranging from administrative matters and ideological investigation to foreign intelligence. In particular, Sub-Office 4 will adopt both the name and the functions of the Gestapo, and will have the task of suppressing all kinds of opposition at the national level. And the man chosen to lead the Gestapo under its new structure is none other than Heinrich Müller, who after Rudolf Diels and Reinhard Heydrich becomes the 3rd director of the Gestapo. The case of Müller is quite particular. In his book The Gestapo, Power and Terror in the Third Reich, researchers Karster Dam and Michel Stoll comment that Müller was, I quote, neither a brilliant figure like Diels nor a charismatic character like Heydrich. He was, to a certain extent, an average official, end quote. As we mentioned, Müller was not necessarily a fervent supporter of National Socialist policies. In fact, Müller did not formally join the ranks of the Nazi Party until May 1939, just 6 months before his appointment as director of the Gestapo. This was in contrast to many high-ranking officials of the regime who had already been in the party for 10 years or more. So, what some authors suggest is that Müller, beyond considering his new role and his new task as positive or negative, due to his irrepressible, commendable discipline, he simply felt that he had to do it, having been an example of life in this sense. The Gestapo, within the Reich Main Security Office, and with the direct mission to investigate and neutralize threats. It is one of the most complex sub-offices, since the Gestapo has several departments. Department A, dedicated to political opposition. Department B, focused on religions and sex. Department C, which is focused on party affairs. Department D, focused on the occupied territories. And Department E, dedicated to security and counterintelligence. From 1939 to 1945, Müller will remain steadfast as a rock in his position as director of the Gestapo. In this regard, among his main tasks were, first, supervising the Gestapo in its missions to identify, arrest, and suppress all enemies of the Nazi regime, including communists, socialists, dissidents, Jews, and members of the German resistance, and controlling the occupied territories during the course of the war. At the same time, he controls and coordinates operations such as those of the so-called Einsatzgruppen, mobile squads responsible for mass murders. especially in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In addition, Müller oversees security and intelligence within Nazi Germany, combating both internal and external espionage, including monitoring subversion within the German military intelligence service itself. At the same time, Müller must oversee the organization of mass deportations and the persecution of Jews, Poles, and other targeted groups. In collaboration with Adolf Eichmann, who was his subordinate in charge of so-called Jewish affairs and the deportations of these people. Müller also acts as a key enforcer of the Nazi regime's political control, ensuring the infiltration and destruction of the underground resistance, political opposition, and any perceived threat by the Gestapo, turning it, according to some, into a key element in the survival of the Third Reich during the World War, which operates from the shadows and makes very few public appearances. Very little escaped Müller, and he quickly established himself as one of the most important figures of the regime, a fact that is evident in his long tenure in the position. While others come and go in various positions of the Third Reich, Müller remains in the same position until the end of the war, no matter the upheavals, like the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, who was, in fact, his immediate superior, in the spring of 1942. The German defeats in 1943, and even the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, after which Müller deploys an entire espionage apparatus to find and execute those responsible. In all these events, more than being loyal to the regime, Müller remains loyal to his position. And under such circumstances, after the defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, the pressure on several war fronts, the advance of the Soviets to Berlin, and what was to come, less about the finances and military capability of the Third Reich. It was living its final days by the first quarter of 1945. Although he continued performing his duties, for Müller, there was little left to monitor, supervise, arrest, or suppress. In that Germany decimated by war, according to some testimonies, by April 1945, Müller still believed in a possible German victory. However, Müller is seen for the last time on April 29, 1945 in the bunker where Adolf Hitler was taking refuge. Hitler, according to Müller, according to the official version, commits suicide the next day, April 30, and from that point on, nothing more was heard about Heinrich Müller after the Führer had died. The authorities of the National Socialist regime signed the capitulation on May 7, 1945. And so the Second World War in Europe comes to an end after 6 years of violent conflict. After the end of the Second World War, the leaders of the Third Reich who managed to survive the conflict faced different destinies. Men like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring committed suicide shortly after being taken prisoner by the Allies. Others, like Wilhelm Keitel and Rudolf Frank, were sentenced to death in the subsequent Nuremberg trials. But what happened to Heinrich Müller? Some sources say that Müller may have died between April 30 and May 7, 1945, near the Luftwaffe headquarters as a result of the Soviet siege of Berlin. But the truth is that this could never be confirmed, since his supposed remains were buried in a mass grave in a Jewish neighborhood, which made it difficult to conduct a forensic analysis that could provide accurate information. Therefore, the whereabouts of Heinrich Müller immediately after the war remained an unsolved mystery after the war. Both the CIA, the British Military Intelligence Service, and the Israeli Mossad searched for him frantically in various parts of the world, but were unable to find him. Müller's family, who never received any information about his whereabouts, was continuously monitored by the German authorities of the Allied occupation. But no trace of any communication between his family and the missing Müller was ever found. Declassified CIA files, enriched by Soviet spies who defected between 1946 and 1947, raised the possibility that Müller was taken to the Soviet Union as a prisoner of war, or even more far-fetched, that he went to work for the Soviet intelligence agencies. The CIA, however, was never able to confirm this information. Finally, in 2013, Johannes Tuchel, director of the German Resistance Memorial Center, stated that, as confirmed by sources from the early days of the German surrender, Müller's body was found with several gunshot wounds and was later buried in a mass grave at the old Jewish cemetery on Krobe-Hanford-Strafe. But, since the Jewish religion prohibits exhumations, it is very unlikely that it will ever be confirmed whether one of the many bodies in that cemetery actually belongs to the man who coldly led the secret police of the Third Reich for 6 years. Adolf Eichmann, another important man, a figure of the National Socialist regime and a key person in the persecution of the Jews. After his arrest in 1960 and during his subsequent trial, he stated the following about Müller, who was his superior in the so-called Jewish affairs of the Gestapo. I quote, "Müller, how can I put it? He was a fighter in body and soul. He was born a soldier and acted as such." End quote. The archetype and presence of Heinrich Müller, further shrouded by his mysterious disappearance, fuels a delicate moral and philosophical debate about those men who, in different historical times, by acting with discipline, coldness, and obedience in their roles as public servants, grease the machinery of regimes that, according to some, are seen as the most nefarious in all of humanity. Meanwhile, for others, figures like Müller are simply men who follow orders, good or bad, depending on who judges them, but orders at the end of the day. Thus, Heinrich Müller, his actions, and his whereabouts remain a great mystery, still unresolved from those days of the Third Reich and World War II. Dear friends, thank you for watching until the end. We hope you enjoyed the video. Your support is vital to this project's growth. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for upcoming releases. See you next time.